The flickering candlelight cast a pale, anemic glow across the vaulted ceiling of the Eternal Pilgrim, each feeble flame a dying star in the vast, suffocating darkness of the sanctuary. For 35 years I, Brother Jude, have walked these echoing corridors, my worn boots scraping against the metallic floor, a rhythm as familiar as the rhythmic thump of my own heart. With each footfall I prayed, a demonstration of my unwavering devotion to the order of the eternal rest. Our grand vessel, a grotesque monument to a faith I now knew was built on lies, drifted through the black, a cathedral adrift in an uncaring cosmos. Its once gleaming arches were now streaked with grime, its stained glass depictions of the ascendant's supposed miracles now clouded with a film of neglect. Each pane, a fractured mosaic of lies that mirrored the shattered remnants of my faith. The air was thick, saturated with the cloying sweetness of incense, a desperate attempt to mask the ship's pervasive stench. It was the aroma of decay, both physical and spiritual, recycled air growing stale, recycled water tasting metallic, and the ever-present undercurrent of something indefinably wrong. It clung to the back of my throat, a constant, nauseating reminder of the Eternal Pilgrim's slow decline, a decay that mirrored the rot within my own soul. We were a dying ship, carrying a dying creed, hurtling towards a salvation that would never come. I could hear the groans of the ship's ancient frame, stressed metal expanding and contracting, a chorus of sounds that spoke of age and fatigue, a language of impending failure that only those who had lived within these walls long enough could understand. Each groan was a harbinger of an inevitable end, an end I now welcomed with a grim resignation. My life had been one of ritual and routine, a carefully orchestrated rhythm of prayer, fasting, and service. As an acolyte, I had scrubbed the unyielding floors until my hands were raw and bleeding, the physical pain a welcome distraction from the emptiness within. As a brother, I had chanted the sacred verses, my voice joining the monotonous drone that echoed through the ship, a clamor of devotion that now seemed like a dirge in my ears. Each syllable was a hollow promise, a meaningless utterance in the face of the universe's vast indifference. And for years I had stood vigil before the sarcophagus, the ornate obsidian coffin that held the being we believed to be our savior, the ascendant. We were taught it was an unbreakable shell, a legacy of the advanced technology from our lost homeworld, a technology we could no longer replicate, let alone understand. The sarcophagus, with its intricate carvings, was the centerpiece of our faith, a symbol of hope in the desolate void. Now, it was a symbol of my folly. Our order's history was etched in fragmented records and half-remembered legends, tales of a cataclysm that had shattered our home world, a technological apocalypse, some whispered, a self-inflicted wound born of hubris. Others spoke of a celestial event, a cosmic fire that had rained down from the heavens, a punishment for our sins. Whatever the truth, it was lost to the abyss of time, leaving only a lingering sense of guilt and a desperate need for redemption. We were, or so we believed, the last of our kind, adrift in the Eternal Pilgrim, carrying the dormant form of the ascendant, a being prophesied to be reborn and guide us to a new golden age. A childish fantasy, a desperate prayer whispered into the uncaring void. Yet, even in the depths of my devotion, a sliver of doubt had always persisted, a tiny, insistent voice I had diligently silenced through prayer and harsh self-discipline. I devoured the Order's archives, seeking knowledge, seeking answers, but finding only more questions. The inconsistencies in our scriptures, the lack of concrete evidence for the Ascendant's divinity, the blind, unquestioning faith demanded by the Elder, all these had gnawed at me, creating fissures in the bedrock of my belief. The loneliness, too, had been a constant companion, a vast emptiness that mirrored the void beyond the ship's hull. Each day was an eternity, each prayer a hollow echo in the silence of space. The faces of my brothers, once a source of comfort, now seemed like masks, hiding the same doubts, the same fears that I struggled to conceal. Brother Caius with his nervous blinking, Brother Marius's increasingly erratic movements, they all hinted at the growing unease. The rhythmic squeak of the cart's wheel provided a steady counterpoint to the pounding of my heart as I pushed it toward the sanctuary. The sarcophagus, as always, dominated the chamber, its smooth obsidian surface absorbing more light than it reflected, a black void in the center of the room. Inside, the ascendant lay in its enforced slumber. But something was different. The air, usually still and heavy, vibrated with energy, like static electricity before a storm, raising the fine hairs on my arms. The instruments in the sanctuary, usually dormant, were flickering erratically, their needles twitching like the limbs of a dying insect. I felt a tremor run through the floor, not the groan of the ship, but something else. Then the impossible happened. The sarcophagus, long believed to be an unbreakable relic of a lost age, began to open. There was no shattering, no explosion of light. Instead, the lid of the sarcophagus, a seamless slab of obsidian, began to slide back, as if pushed by an unseen force. The movement was accompanied by a low, grating sound, like stone grinding against stone. From within the sarcophagus, the ascendant emerged. It did not simply rise, but unfolded, as if its body had been compressed, packed tightly into the confines of the coffin. First, a limb, a thick column of glistening, skinless muscle reached out, its end five-fingered hand that gripped the edge of the sarcophagus with surprising dexterity. Then another muscular limb followed, and another, each one pulling the creature further out of its obsidian prison. Its movements were fluid, yet unsettling, a grotesque parody of birth. The air filled with the wet, organic sounds of its unfolding form, a symphony of squelches and rips accompanied by the coppery tang of some unknown bodily fluid. The creature pulled itself from the sarcophagus, its form shifting and reforming even as it moved, a horrifying mass of exposed organs, and its multiple lidless eyes opened one by one, each one focusing on me. I knew in that instant that our God was not a savior, but a flesh weaver. Brother Caius, ever the devout fool, rushed forward, his face alight with religious ecstasy, believing this to be the prophesied return. "The ascendant is reborn," he cried, his voice trembling with awe. The flesh weaver's response was swift and brutal. A pseudopod, a thick muscular appendage of raw muscle, lashed out, wrapping around Caius's torso with terrifying speed. I watched, paralyzed by horror, as Caius was lifted from the ground, his screams cut short as the creature began to absorb him. His body withered, his skin turning grey and papery as his life force was drained, the process sickeningly visible through his now translucent skin. The flesh weaver's form visibly swelled with a surge of new energy, its wounds closing, its flesh becoming momentarily more whole. Then it turned its attention to me. A voice, not heard with my ears, but impressed directly upon my mind, filled my consciousness. It was a torrent of images, sensations, and raw, untamed need, at the center of it all a singular, burning imperative: serve. A new purpose, terrible and terrifying, was etched into my very being. My faith was dead, replaced by a chilling understanding. I was not a chosen disciple, but a prisoner, a slave to an abomination. My hands, once instruments of prayer, were now stained with the blood of my brothers, and my soul, once devoted to a false god, was now bound to an eternal, horrifying servitude. The stench of Brother Caius's rapidly decaying organic matter hung heavy in the air. The sarcophagus stood behind the creature, closed, intact, a silent, mocking reminder of the faith I had once held. It was now an empty shell, just like my belief. My stomach churned, threatening to empty its meager contents onto the floor. The creature, now surging with Caius's stolen vitality, regarded me with its multitude of lidless eyes. Each one a window into an abyss of alien hunger tracked my every movement, a constant suffocating surveillance that left me feeling utterly exposed and vulnerable. Serve. The command echoed in my mind, not as words, but as a raw, visceral imperative, a primal urge that clawed its way into my consciousness, threatening to override my very will. Fear, cold and sharp as a shard of obsidian from the shattered sarcophagus, pierced through me. My legs trembled, threatening to give way beneath me. A primal urge to bolt, to scramble away from that shifting mass of organs and eyes, surged through me, making my muscles twitch. But where could I run? The eternal pilgrim was now a hunting ground, and I, a mouse trapped in a cage with a monstrous, shape-shifting cat. My survival, a cruel and twisted joke, now hinged on my obedience to this thing. What do you want from me?" I stammered, the words catching in my throat. I cursed myself for speaking, for breaking the silence that had for a moment offered a fragile shield. The flesh weaver's response was a torrent of images that flooded my mind. I saw visions of writhing flesh, of bodies being consumed and reformed, of an endless, insatiable hunger. I felt the creature's burning need to regenerate, to become whole again after its long enforced slumber. The understanding, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through my fear. It needed more life, more brothers. The Order, my brothers, the only family I had ever known, were to become unwilling sustenance for this abomination. And I, Jude, the once devout, the ever-faithful, was to be the shepherd leading his flock to the slaughter. A wave of nausea came over me, so intense I had to double over, my hands braced against my knees. My body convulsed, but nothing came up. There was nothing left inside me to give. The flesh weaver, in its own grotesque way, seemed to understand my turmoil. It projected a new sensation into my mind, a chillingly pragmatic directive overlaid with a touch of what I could only interpret as cruel amusement. It showed me images of my brothers, their routines, their vulnerabilities. Brother Marius, lost in his night prayers in the observation dome, his back to the door, completely unaware of his surroundings. Brother Linus, diligently working in the hydroponics bay, tending to the meager crops that supplemented our recycled food supply, isolated and alone in the lower decks. The creature was teaching me, showing me how to hunt, how to exploit the very faith and camaraderie that had once bound us together. It was giving me the tools to become its instrument of death, its betrayer. The eternal pilgrim, once filled with the rhythmic chants of the Order, was now a tomb of silence, punctuated only by the occasional frantic screams that were abruptly cut short. Each scream was a fresh stab of guilt, a new weight added to the crushing burden on my soul. I became adept at the grim task the creature had set for me. I learned to use the ship's communication systems, long neglected and poorly maintained, to my advantage. A fabricated maintenance request sent to Brother Paul, known for his meticulous nature, lured him to a remote section of the engineering deck. A digitally altered prayer schedule displayed on the data pads we each carried isolated Brother Thomas during his meditation cycle, making him easy prey. I moved through the corridors like a ghost, my footsteps muffled by the thick layers of dust that had accumulated in the neglected corners of the ship. I avoided the other brothers as much as possible, fear and shame warring within me. My reflection in the dusty viewports was that of a stranger, my eyes empty. The once crisp white robes of the Order were now stained and torn, a mirror to the tattered remnants of my spirit. The weight of the silence was crushing. The absence of my brothers' voices now filled with imagined sounds of my own guilt. The flesh weaver continued to feed, its form changing with each victim it consumed. It grew larger, its movements more fluid, its presence more pervasive. The exposed organs across its surface seemed to multiply, a grotesque arrangement of flesh that was constantly in motion. It took to following me, sometimes at a distance, sometimes pressing close, its multiple eyes never leaving me, a constant, suffocating reminder of my servitude. The wet, slapping sounds of its movement became the soundtrack to my nightmare. At times, its multiple lidless eyes would swivel towards me in unison, and at others, its grotesque excuse of a mouth would twist open and close, revealing rows of its teeth. One night, huddled in the darkness of my cell, I saw movement in the corridor outside. It was Brother Alfred, his face etched with worry, his eyes darting nervously around. He was searching for Brother David, his closest companion, who I had delivered to the Fleshweaver only hours before. Alfred's voice, when he saw me, was filled with a desperate hope that twisted something deep within me. "Jude, have you seen David? He was supposed to meet me for our evening prayer, but he never arrived." For a moment I hesitated. Could I warn him? Could I save him? But the Fleshweaver's presence, a suffocating weight in my mind, extinguished the spark before it could become a flame. Serve. The command, a relentless tide, eroded my resolve, leaving only the bitter taste of self-preservation. He was called away by the Elder, I lied, the words tasting like poison on my tongue. An urgent matter, in the lower levels. Alfred's shoulders slumped with relief. "Thank the Ascendant," he mumbled, before turning towards the lower levels, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, each one a nail in the coffin of my soul. I watched him go, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. I was a monster, a betrayer, a puppet dancing to the tune of an abomination. My survival, bought with the lives of my brothers, felt less like a victory and more like an eternal damnation. My only solace was the knowledge that each brother delivered was one less opportunity for the creature to choose me as its next meal. A selfish, desperate comfort. But in this nightmare, it was all I had left. My existence had become a horrifying equation. Their lives for mine, their screams for my silence, their deaths for my survival. And with each passing day, the equation tilted further towards an abyss from which there could be no return. The creature was growing, and my time was running out. The silence on the eternal pilgrim had become absolute, a crushing void where the frantic screams and desperate pleas of my brothers once echoed. Brother Andrew, with his infectious laugh, Brother Mark, with his quiet wisdom, Brother John, the last acolyte, with his youthful eagerness. All gone, consumed, sacrificed. I, Jude, the shepherd-turned-butcher, had delivered the last of my flock to the Fleshweaver, fulfilling my horrific bargain. The creature, now a grotesque mountain of flesh that almost filled the corridors, swelled with their stolen life force. It no longer needed to hunt. I was the only one left, a solitary mouse in a charnel house, awaiting the inevitable. For days I wandered the deserted ship. I scavenged for scraps of food, for drops of recycled water in the hydroponics bay, the plants withered and lifeless without the care of Brother Linus, their last caretaker. Each mouthful was a bitter reminder of my failure, each step a heavy tread towards my inescapable doom. I knew the Fleshweaver was aware of my movements. Its multitude of eyes, now scattered across its massive form, followed me from the walls, from the ceiling, from the very floor beneath my feet. It could have taken me at any moment, but it didn't. Driven by a desperate, hollow hope, I found myself drawn to the ship's archive, a repository of the Order's knowledge, now a monument to their folly. Perhaps, within the digital reams of data, some forgotten piece of information, some overlooked detail about the creature's origin, might offer a sliver of a chance, a way out of this nightmare, however minute. The data terminals, once filled with the soft hum of electronic life, stood silent, their dark screens reflecting the fear in my own eyes. As I navigated the archaic interface, a new odor, sharp and acrid, began to permeate the air, cutting through the usual stale scent of recycled air. It was the smell of raw meat, of exposed viscera, and it was getting stronger. Accompanying it was a wet, slapping sound, like a butcher repeatedly throwing a cut of meat on a metal surface. Each impact grew louder, closer, confirming my worst fears. The Fleshweaver was on the other side of that door, and its hunger was unmistakable. It was coming for me. Panic seized me, a cold wave washing away any pretense of hope. I stumbled back from the terminal, my eyes darting around the archive, searching for an escape, a hiding place, anything to delay the inevitable. but there was nowhere to go. The Flesh Weaver had anticipated this. It had herded me here, to this place of knowledge, of history, to make a final, horrifying point. This was a calculated move, a deliberate act of psychological torment. The creature entered the archive. It filled the doorway, a wall of flesh that blocked out the already dim light, its surface a shifting mass of organs, of eyes that blinked and swiveled, fixing their gaze upon me. A pseudopod, thicker than my torso, snaked out, its tip splitting into multiple finger-like appendages that reached, explored, grasped. I was lifted, my feet leaving the ground, my body pulled towards the creature's core. I expected the agonizing dissolution I had witnessed with my brothers, the feeling of being devoured, of having my life force drained away. But the Flesh Weaver had a different fate in store for me, a fate far more grotesque. As I was drawn into the creature's mass, I felt an unsettling sensation, a feeling of being invaded, not just physically but on a cellular level. It was as if my very being was being dissected, analyzed, and then reassembled. Agony, unlike anything I had ever experienced, coursed through me. My bones felt like they were being twisted and reshaped from within, my muscles spasming in a series of rapid, uncontrolled contractions and relaxations, like a puppet on 1,000 strings being yanked in different directions. My skin burned as if seared by 1,000 flames. Yet, I could not scream. My vocal cords were paralyzed, my voice trapped within a body that was rapidly ceasing to be my own. The creature was not simply consuming me. It was integrating me, weaving me into its own biological framework, a permanent part of its horrific structure. It was performing a horrific symbiosis, making me a part of it, while keeping my mind intact. Through the excruciating pain, I understood. The Flesh Weaver was not merely feeding. It was creating a self-sustaining system, a closed loop of consumption and regeneration. I was to be its eternal food source, my body perpetually broken down and rebuilt, providing it with sustenance while ensuring my continued suffering. I was to be its larder, its living battery. My mind, my consciousness would remain intact, a horrified observer trapped within a body that was no longer mine, forced to endure an unending cycle of agony. I existed in a perpetual state of torment, my body a prison, my mind a battlefield where despair and horror waged an eternal war. The Flesh Weaver's consciousness was a constant, oppressive presence that I could sense, but not comprehend. It felt no remorse for the pain it inflicted, no pity for the lives it had extinguished. I was simply a tool, a resource to be exploited, an unending source of fuel for its monstrous existence. The eternal pilgrim drifted aimlessly through the black void, a consequence of the Order's folly and my ultimate betrayal. It carried within it a single, monstrous entity, a creature of nightmare, and its eternally suffering prisoner, a living monument to the price of blind faith. My consciousness, a flickering candle in the vast darkness of the creature's being, was all that remained of Brother Jude, the once devout, the ever faithful, now the eternally damned. The silence of the ship was broken only by the creature's internal workings, the constant changing and reforming of flesh, a grotesque lullaby that serenaded me in my torment. And as the eternal pilgrim drifted further into the unknown, I knew that my suffering would never end, that I was destined to be a part of this abomination, this Flesh Weaver, for all eternity. For now, though, it was clear what the creature intended. The sounds, the trajectory, it was taking the ship somewhere. It was going to find more victims.